Hello again. The last time I had you, we were talking about some of the things that ultimately turn into unanswered questions in the 1970s. We see feminism on the rise. We see the Supreme Court getting in on this act, handing down really, really important decisions like the Roe versus Wade decision that legalizes abortion. And of course, this means very different things to different groups of people. We know that the combination of feminism and the Roe decision reawakens what we've called the religious right, a very important voting bloc in American electoral history. In short, what we covered was the social history and to a lesser extent the political history of the 1970s. Today what I want to talk about is the economic side of the 1970s, at least the late 1970s. And I want to begin by pointing out that up until this point, the early 1970s, we've really been talking about a pretty vibrant American economy. It's been a really good time to be America with respect to its economic position in the world. Remember, when we emerged from World War II, we not only emerged in one piece, unlike Britain, Germany, France, Japan, Italy, but we actually emerged with a greater capacity to produce. That was incredibly unique. Well, by the 1970s, the economies of both Germany and Japan and other countries too had been rebuilt, and they were rebuilt mean and lean, and they were way more competitive, as you'll see, than American corporations were by the 1970s. So we are now talking about a global economy, and that's a significant development considering we had been number one for decade after decade primarily because there was no other competition. Now you take this and you combine it with the fact that there's an emerging energy crisis in America by the early 1970s. OPEC, the oil-producing economies of the world, were predominantly concentrated in the Middle East. Now, ever since World War II, we had really been big partners with Middle Eastern countries when it comes to buying their crude oil. That's really going to change toward the end of the 1960s. Now, we've talked about things like the assassination of Robert Kennedy. Sirhan was very, very upset by Kennedy's statement that he believed that Israel had a right to exist. A couple of years later, what you've got is something called the Yom Kippur War, where several Middle Eastern countries teamed up and fought Israel in this war, and it took the Israelis only days to destroy that effort. So the Israelis were victorious, and not by a little, by a lot. But part of the reason that they were so victorious is because we had armed Israel. They had the best weapons and weapon systems that money could buy, primarily because they were our allies. And so what you've got by the 1970s is an unmistakable anti-American sentiment that has really developed and is now crystallized in the Middle East. And when you can't beat somebody on the battlefield, you've got to think outside the box with respect to how to defeat them. And one of the things that the Middle Eastern world begins to do when it comes to standing up to what they consider to be American aggression is they raise oil prices and they stop producing as much oil. And so this is the proximate cause of the energy crisis. What we're going to talk about now are the ramifications of the crisis. Simply put, we were not ready for this. I mean, we've never really been ready for this, but that's another story. It destroyed business in Detroit. I mean, the big three were still building muscle cars when all of this hits, and we were not expecting something like gas to go, triple, quadruple, seemingly overnight. It was not out of the ordinary whatsoever for gas stations to simply run out of gas. And it got a lot of people thinking, we've got to figure out alternative ways to power the United States. Some people started talking about nuclear power. It was clean, it was renewable, and best of all, we controlled it. And so a lot of people think that that's the energy of the future. Until 3 Mile Island almost melted down in western Pennsylvania. Now, you and I know what happens when a nuclear reactor melts down. We've known about Fukushima in the aftermath of the Japanese tsunami, and the radiation that could emanate because of something like that. We know about Chernobyl, even earlier than that, a Russian nuclear plant that went down. One of these things go down, and it's the equivalent of an atomic bomb going off. And so, in the aftermath of 3 Mile Island, a lot of people really begin to back away from this whole idea of nuclear energy being the energy of the future. Now, back to our discussion of this global economy. Germany and Japan had not only rebuilt their economies to function in a modern 20th century context, they were actually building things that Americans wanted to buy. You could talk about a lot of different, specific examples with respect to what Americans are wanting to buy. But in particular, with respect to automobiles, the German and the Japanese cars were gas sippers. Meanwhile, Detroit was still producing gas guzzlers. Not only that, the quality was great. The Volkswagen Beetle, not only did it do great on gas, it was tough. It was very durable. It was a very quality product, and Americans ate it up. Meanwhile, you've got the Ford Motor Company that's producing things like the Ford Pinto, which was, in addition to being not all that great of a car to begin with, tended to explode when it got rear-ended. Its gas tank was in the back, and it had a metal bumper on it, so when you do the math here, you got metal scraping on metal. If that gas tank cracks, you can understand what's going on. So anyway, what a lot of American CEOs argued, and I'm not just talking about in the auto industry, across the board, was that American workers were paid too much. They were just simply paid too much, that years of unionization had artificially driven up wages, and that made the American firms uncompetitive with respect to the Germans or the Japanese. If you're following along with me, I want you to flip to that slide that is entitled Deindustrialization and the Impact on the American Middle Class. What you're going to see is a graph. And if you look at that graph, starting out in the late 1970s, the blue line, follow the blue line, that's productivity. And as you can see, productivity is going up over the course of the late 20th century. So American workers are actually able to do more than we've ever been able to do before. And if you think about it, you've got the invention of the computer during that period, the development of the internet, cell phones are becoming much more mainstream, and you can understand why we would be more productive. We've got better technology to work with. Take a look at the dotted red line. That dotted red line is the median wage over the course of the late 20th century. And what that line is doing is it's just simply saying flat. And so what that means is over the course of the late 20th century and really into the 21st century, American workers, for all intents and purposes, have not had a real raise. And what that means is at the same time that it costs more to buy your milk and your potatoes or go to school, all right, go to college, you're paying more and more for that. You're not getting a raise. And it's a term that economists refer to as stagflation. Wages are stagnant at the same time that inflation is raising the cost of living. Now, in order to address the issue that they successfully convinced everybody was at hand, that the idea that American workers just simply made too much, they said, we've got to relocate to more business-friendly locations. Not where you may think, though. Initially, American producers begin to leave the industrial heartland of Chicago, Detroit, New York, Boston, Oakland, California, and they begin to relocate in the South and the Southwest, what a lot of people will call the Sun Belt. Now, this is a process known as deindustrialization, the stripping away of the manufacturing sector in the United States' economy. Businesses are leaving places like Detroit because Detroit was a heavily unionized town. I mean, this is one reason among a lot of others, but in any case, this is a really important reason. The thought is it's easier and less expensive to do business in a place like Tennessee as opposed to Detroit, because Tennessee has really taken that 1947 Taft-Hartley Act that gave state governments the ability to decide how easy it was going to be to form a union, giving them the ability to make that final decision. In any case, what this is going to lead to is the idea of a Rust Belt. Okay, the idea that once upon a time Detroit or Oakland were once these beacons of industrialization, Now they are these old rotting factory towns where nobody lives anymore, and they are suffering from what we've talked about earlier in this class, the urban crisis. Okay. Now, the other problem that the American economy has on it is the withdrawal from Vietnam. The bottom line is we pay for the Vietnam War in the late 1970s. What you're looking at there, if you're following along with me, April 30th, 1975, that's the last helicopter ride out of Saigon. And very shortly after that helicopter left, communist forces came down the peninsula and they united Vietnam under one banner. And this is perceived as our first military loss. Now, it's not as if we signed on the dotted line and procured our surrender, but we simply said, look, we've been here for over 10 years and, enough is enough and we've fought enough and therefore you're going to be whatever you want to be. And ultimately, they decided they were going to be communist, okay? But 60,000 U.S. combat deaths later, many, many more were wounded. Vietnam is really going to have a traumatic impact on the American psyche from a foreign policy relations, but for the time being, it's really, really a drag on our economy. We're paying for it through inflation and other sorts of issues that are really hampering the American economy. Now, all of these problems fell into the lap of Jimmy Carter. In 1976, Jimmy Carter ran for president as a Democrat, and he ran against Jerry Ford, who was the guy that had pardoned Richard Nixon in the aftermath of the Watergate scandal. So I'm not going to call this a can't-lose situation. It was relatively close, I guess, generally speaking. But at the same time, the Republicans are really in some troubled waters with respect to selling the American people on Jerry Ford, okay? Some of you may remember Jimmy Carter from things like Habitat for Humanity. If you follow politics, the Democrats do like to bring him out on stage for a Democratic National Convention. He's a very influential man still in American politics to some extent as we speak. But he presented himself in 1976 as an outsider. In other words, Jack Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Jerry Ford, they were all Washington insiders. Elect me, and I'll get back to doing what the president was originally designed to do as far as the Founding Fathers were concerned. Okay? Well, all of this might sound really nice, but the simple fact of the matter is Jimmy Carter generally lacked experience, and he was no match for seasoned veterans in Washington, D.C. More or less as a side note, Carter was from Georgia, and he was the first American president to be elected from the Deep South since before the Civil War. Just kind of an interesting aside. In any case, we need to talk about his domestic policy. Keep in mind, Jimmy Carter inherited one of the most intensive economic downturns, really in American history, but certainly since the Great Depression. And his response to this crisis was really twofold. One, he said, energy independence. That's what we need. We need to have, energy sources that are controlled by Americans and that are largely renewable. This is never really welcome news. I mean, it's the equivalent of saying, you need to go on a diet. Well, the reason that nobody smiles when they hear that is because largely what you're talking about is something that's difficult. It's hard not to eat the kind of things that you want to eat. It's difficult to kind of break your addiction to easy, accessible energy like gas and other sorts of things, okay? To that end, one of the things that Carter recommended was a 55-mile-an-hour national speed limit, okay? Now, I don't know about you, but when you see 55 miles an hour, generally that's code for 60, and that's if the cop is really, really bored, okay? I am, by no stretch of the imagination, encouraging to go out there and speed. I'm just simply saying, we're Americans. We drive fast, and we drive gas-guzzling, SUVs, okay? So this really wasn't a very popular measure, even though I think that Jimmy Carter deserves a little bit of credit when it comes to, had we actually gotten serious about energy independence in the 70s, maybe we're not where we don't want to be in the early 2000s. It's, more or less an interesting idea. We have no way of proving anything, so I guess that's all that we can say about that. But in any case, Carter's other, attempt to address the economy is by deregulating it. He felt that there was simply too little competition in the marketplace and that he needed to do things that would encourage competition. And to that end, he felt that he needed to really cut the Washington red tape, get the government out of the way so that firms could compete, because at that point prices are going to come down. And when prices come down, more and more people will be willing to buy, and when that happens, the economy will come back. Again, it sounds great on paper, and when you go to implement it in reality, it's a different situation. I could list of several different industries where this happened, but in particular, let's pay close attention to the airline industry. My guess is many of you have never taken a flight on TWA. You might have heard of Pan Am, especially if you like to watch James Bond movies, but you don't know of these airliners like even Northwest. I remember growing up flying Northwest flights. But I bet you have heard of American, you've heard of Delta, you've heard of Southwest. When Jimmy Carter got government out of the airline industry, what happened was these massive corporations like American were free to go out and gobble up their competition, very similar to what John Rockefeller was doing at the turn of the 20th century with Standard Oil. It was real simple with Standard Oil. You joined them, you sold to them, or you were taken over most of the time hostile takeovers. Okay? So anyway, deregulation did the opposite of what Carter was hoping it was going to do. It actually limited competition even further. The rich got richer, if you will. They went out there, they bought up their competition, or they priced them out of the market, and therefore it was a drying up of competition. It backfired. Now, with respect to Carter's foreign policy, it actually gets even worse for him, if you can believe this. In 1953, the British and the Americans staged a political coup in Iran, and part of the reason why was that the former leader of the Iranians had nationalized Iran's oil, meaning that everything underneath the sands of Iran belonged to the people of Iran, and they would use that money to build schools and hospitals and make Iran into a first world country. The British and the Americans worried that that would jeopardize their ability to purchase oil from the region, and so instead they installed an individual that came to be known as the Shah. If you've ever seen the Ben Affleck movie, it'll depict the early stages of what comes to be known as the Iranian Revolution. But Muhammad Razi, who comes to be known as the Shah, was a brutal dictator. I mean, I don't have time to really go through this line by line, but just take my word for it that the Iranian people suffered mightily from 1953 to 1979. And by 79, they had had enough of him. They overthrew the Shah, forced him into exile, and they implemented the regime, or a regime, that is quite similar to the regime that you see ruling Iran to this day. In the process, they demanded that the Shah be brought back to Iran, where he would stand trials for crimes against the Iranian people. Well, at the time, he was a very old man, and he was suffering from cancer, and he had been taken in by the United States. The Iranian revolutionaries are demanding that he comes back. And we said no. He was old, he was suffering from cancer, we wanted to treat that cancer, and we said we're not going to bring him back, which enraged the revolutionaries, who overran the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Again, if you've ever seen the Ben Affleck film Argo, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, right? In the process of overrunning our embassy, our diplomats in Tehran, the capital city of Iran, they took 66 American hostages, parading them through the streets of the capital city, and there are news crews on hand that are broadcasting this into American living rooms on a day-to-day basis. Well, this makes Jimmy Carter look incredibly weak on foreign policy, and ultimately it destroyed his presidency. I mean, the people that are going to run against Carter in 1980 are really going to be quick to point out, look, this guy's really soft on our supposed enemies, okay? If you can imagine, it actually got a little bit worse for Jimmy Carter as 1979 continued to unfold. In December of 1979, the Soviet Union decided that it was going to invade its neighbor to the south, and that would be Afghanistan. Okay. you can't get much more textbook example of communism on the march, communism taking over other countries, than the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The problem is, one, we're just getting out of Vietnam. This is not exactly the most opportune time to start World War III. And secondly, that to really send in the Marines to go and liberate Afghanistan would have been to start World War III. So we're really in between a rock and a hard place with respect to doing something about this. And at the same time, you've got these Soviet helicopters that are flying all across Afghanistan, shooting anything that moves. It's a humanitarian crisis at the same time. Now, later on, several U.S. presidents, Carter included, would move to help the resistance. And by resistance, I mean individuals like Osama bin Laden, who was operating what would later become known as Al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan. It was a decision that paid short-term gains in the sense that they were a massive thorn in the Soviet side. But I don't think I need to tell you how that one came back to bite us in the end. In any case, like the Iranian crisis, the Soviet invasion was broadcasted into American living rooms on a night-by-night basis. This is incredibly problematic for poor Jimmy Carter. Okay? At the same time, you see this continued rise of the political right. We talked about the religious right the last time we met. We know that we're beginning to transition into a much more conservative, right-of-center country, and the religious right tend to gravitate to the Republican Party, so this is part and parcel of that process. The problem with conservatives, religious, social, financial, whatever it is that you want to call them, is not that there aren't any of them out there in American life. There's actually quite a few. The problem is they're incredibly disorganized. They just really lack that one individual that can bring people together. Case in point would be the 1964 election where Barry Goldwater, conservative from Arizona, ran against Lyndon Johnson and got his doors blown off. Johnson easily defeated him, but the silver lining for Barry Goldwater's campaign was a former Hollywood actor that had turned into a politician, a guy by the name of Ronald Reagan. Now, Reagan gave this speech entitled A Time for Choosing, where he basically challenged Americans to think, do you really want an American intellectual elite in Washington planning your lives day by day for you? Or do you feel that the American Revolution really meant something and you can plan your life better than the government can plan it for you? Well, this resonated with a lot of conservatives, and Reagan went on to become the governor of liberal California. And so by the mid-1970s, Ronald Reagan is not only a household name, he's sort of the darling of the conservative movement in the sense that as governor of California, he stood for things like a smaller government. He reduced the government programs, some of which had a really good result and some of which did not. He lowered taxes. He cut a lot of state government red tape, and he was tough on crime. Keep in mind, the Watts rebellions were still very much in the minds of California voters, and this guy out there that's now this new governor in 1966 getting tough with all these people who may or may not have had a legitimate cause for concern, being tough with respect to people that are breaking the law, it resonated with conservatives. You take this and you combine it with Reagan's popular image. A lot of people don't know this, but before Ronald Reagan was a Republican, he was actually a New Deal Franklin Roosevelt Democrat. As I mentioned before, though, he was also a Hollywood actor. He really wasn't in too many films that you would have seen. And by the early 1950s, his star had pretty much set in Hollywood. He got picked up by a corporation called General Electric, who sponsored this program called the General Electric Hour. Reagan was the pretty face that was hawking radios and refrigerators and things like that, but part of GE's program here involved him familiarizing the American public with GE's programs and policies. It was public relations, and it had been done really since the invention of radio, so it's nothing new. But it really changed Ronald Reagan because he picked up on those corporate rumblings in boardrooms that taxes were too high and government was too intrusive, and so he really switches teams here. He moves away from this New Deal Democrat and becomes what you would call a conservative. He's got this cowboy image, was a rancher out in California, so he's got this rugged individual kind of reputation to him. He was an evangelical Christian, and he really didn't care who knew it. Would let anybody that was willing to listen know that as the governor, he prayed openly. At times he would begin meetings with a prayer. And he's seen as this conservative sort of hero. In other words, he's the guy by the late 1970s that conservatives have been waiting for over a generation to emerge, to kind of bring everybody, the religious right and fiscal conservatives, bring everybody under one banner. Now, part of this process is the emergence of the new right. We were talking about the new left in the 1960s, and we knew how they were a really important part of not only Jack Kennedy's election, but Lyndon Johnson's election. This was that youthful militant protest movement that was rebelling against things like America's foreign policy in Vietnam. Well, the new right grew out of the late 1960s, and the disillusionment, the disappointment that a lot of people had in that decade, and, a lot of the disappointment in America, largely speaking. In other words, the new right was, kind of the exact opposite of the new left in the sense that it wanted America to go back to a much more traditional, or what was thought of as a much more traditional role, both domestically and internationally. To do what was right by standing up to communism, to shrink the size of government, much like Dwight Eisenhower had done in the 1950s. Not necessarily scrap everything, but certainly scrap the things that made sense. And so all of this is coming together in 1980 when Ronald Reagan launched his campaign for president in New York City, actually Liberty Island, but it was in the backdrop of the Statue of Liberty. Reagan's nickname was the Great Communicator, and he really was like Franklin Roosevelt in the sense that he really had a knack for talking to people. He was, a very charismatic person. And when he launched his career, when he launched his presidential candidacy, he said, again, we're talking about the middle of an economic crisis. A recession is when you lose a recession is when your neighbor loses his job. A depression is when you lose your job. And an economic recovery is when Jimmy Carter loses his job. Okay, so it resonated with people. He had a very warm, inviting smile, a very vibrant personality, and the ability to speak to people really resonated with the American people. Simultaneously, Carter's approval ratings heading into the general elections is hovering around 20%. Now, that's incredibly low. I mean, even by modern standards, and we've seen some pretty low approval ratings these days. In any case, what really was the tipping point was in the presidential debates, which again were televised, where Reagan looked directly into the camera, and he said, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" And there were a lot of liberals who couldn't even make the case that the economy was better, that our outlook on the economic forecast was better than 4 years ago, that we were not as well respected throughout the world as the leader of the free world than before Carter had assumed his presidency. And so what we're talking about here is something that historians call the Reagan Revolution. Now, on the one hand, the Reagan Revolution means that we're talking about unabashed, unapologetic conservatism. It's not conservatism like Dwight Eisenhower and modern republicanism. We're just going to spin this New Deal thing in a different direction. We're talking about going in a completely different direction from the New Deal altogether. At the same time, it demonstrates, and this is very important, the completion of a process that began all the way back in 1968. We began to become a more conservative country back in 1968, and that process is complete by 1980 with the Reagan Revolution. We are, with the Reagan Revolution, a right-of-center conservative country. Our talking points are, our political orientation is, just ask anybody what they think of taxes, and 9 times out of 10, what you're going to get is that person that says they need to be cut. They need to be cut across the board. Rich people, poor people, and everybody in between. This is something that really comes out of the Reagan Revolution. Let me leave off with this. For years and years, part of the key cornerstone voting bloc of the Democratic Party had been industrial union workers, right? Auto workers and teamsters and miners and construction workers, and the list goes on and on. They, if nobody else, could always be counted on, almost like 90%, to vote for the Democratic running for whatever office that you're talking about. And that's really going to change in 1980. And what these individuals are going to be called are Reagan Democrats. Now, what a Reagan Democrat means, some of you may have heard that before. What that means is a person that, for all intents and purposes, has been a lifelong Democratic voter, but in the 1980s kind of switched teams. I mean, sometimes this was permanent, sometimes it wasn't. But in any case, these are people that were largely cornerstones of the Democratic Party that have now moved over to the Republican Party, and it's a bigger example of what we can largely call the Reagan Revolution. Now, the next time we meet, we're going to be talking about Reagan's actual presidency, and we're going to see that there are very good things that come out of this and things that are relatively negative. But in any case, that's where we'll pick it up the next time we meet.